Hello and welcome. Today we are covering Standard 2300 series. This is an all-important series regarding performing the engagement. Normally in the previous vlogs I have covered standard by standard all the series, but this time I'm trying to cover all the 5 standards in one vlog because I think it will be more useful for all the auditors to have a complete idea of what are the areas within this. The standards which series 2300 covers are performing the engagement, identifying information, analysis and evaluation, documenting information, engagement and supervision. So let's try to cover all these things. But before we get off to a start, let us start with the same customary practice of asking some interesting questions, and then we'll go ahead with reviewing these standard by standard and getting the responses to those questions. How internal auditors should approach engagements? What is sufficient, reliable, relevant and useful information? Why the adequacy of control design is often completed as part of engagement planning? Why internal auditors should review organizational policies and jurisdictional laws related to data privacy? Can analytical procedures also be used during engagement planning? What to do professional judgment differences? And who has overall responsibilities for supervising the engagement? In case you are new to my videos, this is Tausif Mushtaq, an audit strategist, control specialist and board advisor with over 2 decades of experience in governance, assurance, risks and controls, fraud examinations and forensic reviews. The objective of my videos and the audit and assurance series is to promote the internal audit profession in its basic spirit, whereby the internal auditors having a clear understanding of the standards and international professional practices framework overall, so they can contribute to achieve the mission of internal audit. The mission of internal audit is as defined by the Institute of Internal Auditors, which is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice and insight. So as per requirement of the first standard of the series 2300, performing the engagement, internal auditors must identify, analyze, evaluate and document sufficient information to achieve the engagement's objective. If we get more explanation through implementation guide, it says that before performing the engagement, internal auditor may benefit from reviewing the information formulated during the planning process, which should include engagement objectives that reflect the results of a preliminary risk assessment conducted by the internal audit activity. You may refer to the standard name given already there. The criteria that will be used to evaluate the governance, risk management and controls of the area or process under review. And third, the work or the engagement work program, which contains the conclusions made during the planning phase, the engagement task and the procedures that will be used to identify, analyze and document engagement information. So work performed during planning phase is typically documented in the work papers and referenced in the work programs. The work may include a risk and control matrix, which links risk and controls with the testing approach, results, observations and conclusions. Process maps, flowcharts and or narrative descriptions of control processes. The results of evaluating the adequacy of control design, a plan and approach for testing the effectiveness of key controls. The level of analysis and detail applied during planning phase varies by internal audit activity and engagement. Evaluating the adequacy of control design is often completed as part of engagement planning because it helps internal auditors clearly identify key controls to be further tested for effectiveness. However, The most appropriate time to perform this evaluation depends on the nature of engagement. If it is not completed during planning, the control design evaluation may occur as a specific stage of engagement performance. Or internal auditors may evaluate the control design while performing tests of control's effectiveness. So what are the considerations for implementation of this implementation guide of 2300? The 2300 series of standards encompasses performing the test outlined in the planning phase and evaluating and documenting the results. As internal auditors reflect on the information needed to accomplish the engagement objectives, they should consider the expectations of the board and senior management. The type of information required and analysis applied may depend on whether the engagement is designed to provide assurance with conclusions or an opinion, or consulting and advice. How internal auditors should approach the engagements? Internal auditors should approach engagements with an objective, yet inquisitive mind and search strategically for information. Example, audit evidence that could help achieve the engagement objectives. At each step in the engagement process, internal auditors apply the professional skepticism to evaluate whether the information is sufficient and appropriate, to provide a reasonable basis on which to formulate conclusions and or recommendations, or whether additional information should be collected. As per standard 2330, documenting information requires internal auditors to document information resulting from the execution of the engagement. The evidence should logically support the conclusions and engagement results. So ultimately, the internal auditors are not reporting anything on the basis of hearsay or on the basis of only some judgments on the basis of some verbal evidences, but need to have some conclusive and concrete evidences. And the more the evidence is strong, the more it will put weight to your finding, and your finding will be more taken by the management, and you will be in a better position to highlight the risk which management is exposed to. So what is a sufficient information? Sufficient information is factual, adequate and convincing so that a prudent and informed persons would reach the same conclusions as the auditor. You may refer to standard 2310 identifying information for this. Thus, engagement information should be collected and documented in such a way that a prudent, informed person, such as another internal auditor or an external assessor, could repeat the engagement and achieve an outcome that confirms the internal auditor results and logically leads to the same conclusions. Internal audit must base conclusions and engagement results on appropriate analysis and evaluations. So as I said in before that, it should not be on the basis of hearsay or verbal discussions, but there has to be an analysis and evaluation behind that, and on the basis of some documentation, that if another internal auditor or external assessor comes, they will be reaching to the same conclusion, and they will not be challenging your way of concluding things without having sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. For assurance engagements and some consulting engagements, the ultimate goal is to reach conclusions about whether the design and operation of key controls support the engagement subjects' ability to achieve its objectives. So why a testing plan is required and should be developed? As part of work program, internal auditors usually create a testing plan to gather evidence about the operating effectiveness of adequately designed key controls. Generally, secondary controls, that is those that improve the process but are not essential, and controls that have a design weakness, that is those unlikely to accomplish their purpose even if they are operating properly, do not need to proceed to the level of effectiveness testing. If the details of the testing plan are not sufficient, internal auditors may need to provide additional testing details, such as the testing criteria and population and sampling methodology, and the sample size needed to obtain sufficient information. So what can be an approach for the evaluation? Standard 2240 A1 requires adjustments to be approved promptly. Internal auditor approach to evaluation often includes a combination of manual audit procedures and computer-assisted audit techniques. For manual audit procedures includes the inquiry, example interviews or surveys, observation, inspection, vouching, tracing, re-performance, confirmation, and analytical procedures, example ratio analysis, trend analysis, benchmarking, comparisons, and all that. For CATs, which includes generally audit software programs and specialized programs that test the processing logic and controls of other software and systems. Evaluation procedures are discussed in more detail in the implementation guide 2320 analysis and evaluation, which we'll be covering in the same this vlog. So where the results of the evaluations are recorded. As evaluations are completed, the results may be recorded in a column added to the risk and control matrix, which is typically documented as a working paper. Entries in the matrix generally include a reference or link to additional work papers that document the details of testing procedures and analysis used, the results, and any additional support for the internal auditor's conclusions. Internal auditor's information, testing results, and the basis for conclusions may also be presented in the form of a summary of the work performed. The Chief Audit Executive usually establishes a common approach to work paper documentation in the internal audit activities, policies, and procedures manual. So documentation is discussed in more detail in 2330, which we will be covering in the later slides. So what documents will be required to demonstrate the conformance with the standard 2300? Engagement work papers that describe the actions, analysis, and evaluations performed during an engagement, as well as the logic supporting the conclusions, opinions, and advice. Working papers normally include a description of any CADs or software that was used during the engagement. You may also add in the same part the ERP related support. Additionally, final engagement communications typically demonstrate conformance. Post-engagement surveys or other feedback mechanism may confirm that the engagement's objectives were achieved from the perspective of the board or senior management. Documentation of engagement supervision may provide evidence of conformance. So second standard for the series 2300 is 2310, which is identifying information. The standard basically requires that internal auditors must identify sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information to achieve engagement's objective. What is sufficient information? We have defined it in the previous standard as well, which is the factual, adequate, and convincing, so that a prudent, informed person would reach the same conclusions as the auditor. Reliable information is the best attainable information through the use of appropriate engagement techniques. Relevant information supports engagement observations and recommendations and is consistent with the objectives for the engagement. Useful information helps the organization meet its goals. So as per implementation guide for standard 2310 identifying information, this standard defines the criteria for information that must be identified. The internal audit activity uses a systematic and disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of governance, risk management, and control processes. The systematic and disciplined approach requires that internal auditors identify, analyze, evaluate, and document information to support the results of an engagement and the internal auditor's conclusions. Internal auditors should prepare to identify information Internal auditors begin gathering information which includes audit evidence when planning the engagement. A review of engagement objective and engagement work program helps prepare internal auditors to identify sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. We have defined these already before. The work program prescribes the procedures internal auditors use to perform the engagement. So we asked some questions when we started. There was a question about that internal auditors should review the data privacy law. Why do we need to do that? It may be helpful for internal auditors to review the organization's policies on the privacy law or the local laws related to data privacy before beginning engagement work. They may also consult with the organization's legal counsel or other applicable subject matter experts to address any questions or concerns that may arise about access to personal information. The process of identifying information is facilitated by open and collaborative communication between the internal auditor and the organization's personnel, especially those directly involved with the area or process under review. Establishing and maintaining effective channels of communication is an important aspect of performing the engagement. So organizational independence of the internal audit activity is also essential for open communication. So what are the considerations for implementation as per the implementation guide? During engagement planning, internal auditors gather information about the audit client and document the information in work papers. The level of analysis and detail applied during the planning phase varies by internal audit activity and engagement. Evaluating the adequacy of control design is often completed as part of engagement planning because it helps internal auditors identify key controls to be further tested for effectiveness. Thus, audit evidence may result from testing the design of control processes. So what level of assurance the internal auditor requires? According to Standard 2310, the reliability of the audit information depends on the use of appropriate engagement techniques. Some techniques take longer or require more resources than others, but may be worth the investment because they enable a higher level of assurance. In general, simple manual audit procedures include respecting physical evidence such as physical property of the area under review, examining documentation from either the audit client or outside sources, gather testimonial evidence through interviews, surveys, or risk and control self-assessments. These are the different sessions you can have. Conducting a walkthrough to observe a process in action, examining data that is continuously monitored via technology. So how sufficiency and reliability of the information enhances? The sufficiency and reliability of information increase when the information is current, corroborated, and obtained directly by an internal auditor, like by an observation or review, or from an independent third party, for example, a bank, or maybe a regulator's correspondence. Information is also more reliable when it is gathered from a system where the controls are operating effectively. Therefore, it is important that the chief audit executive establishes a system of documentation, including preferred terminology and standardized notations. For example, symbols or tick marks, or maybe a specific color of pen, and that internal auditor use this system consistently. Documentation is discussed in the implementation guide 2330, documenting information. Because engagement resources are not unlimited, it is important for internal auditor to identify and prioritize the most relevant and useful information. It is also important for internal auditor to critically assess all the engagement information as a whole, rather than relying on a singular example, as their conclusions and advice are based on evidence that is persuasive rather than absolute. So for the documentation to consider the demonstrating the conformance with this standard are more or less similar, which is the engagement work program and supporting engagement work papers, which may be stored electronically or in paper format. Work papers are usually organized in order of the work program, and linked to the work program, whether they exist as individual pages or audit steps in a computerized audit system. As a result of supervision, evidence to support objectives is achieved through identification of sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. Surveys, as we said before, could be issued to personnel in the area under review after our audit engagement communications are completed. The Chief Audit Executive monitors the disposition of the engagement results communicated to management, which may provide evidence of the usefulness of the information communicated. So the third standard of the series is 2320, which is analysis and evaluation. This describes the actual implementation of planned procedures. During series 2200 engagement planning, we learned that while planning the engagement, internal auditors must develop a work program to achieve the engagement objectives. Also, for assurance engagements, the work program must include the procedures for identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and documenting engagement information. Standard 2320 requires internal auditors to analyze and evaluate the information obtained during the engagement before drawing conclusions. Internal auditors must base conclusions and engagement results on appropriate analysis and evaluations as per standard requirement of 2320. So as per implementation guide, when planning the engagement and creating the work program, internal auditors may have completed several engagement steps and generated important information, including a risk and control matrix and an evaluation of the adequacy of control design. The work program often links to work papers that document the work completed, information produced, and resulting decisions. The example of typical work papers include a planning memorandum or checklist, flowcharts or narrative descriptions of key processes, a process level risk map, and a risk and control matrix that documents the links between risk controls, the testing approach, summaries of interviews, results, evidences, and conclusions. So how is the transition from planning to performing? The transition from planning to performing an engagement may vary, may not be completely distinct, because both phases involve some degree of analyzing and evaluating audit information. This is an important concept which each internal auditor needs to understand. Often during planning phase, the internal auditors identify controls and evaluate the adequacy of their design, because this helps them identify key controls to be tested further for evidence, for effectiveness. That shows that the internal auditor does not have to wait all the time that when the execution or performance time will come, I'll check that. If some minor step is there available in front of them during planning phase, they can get it done at the same time. Performing the engagement generally involves conducting the test prescribed in the work paper to gather evidence about the operating effectiveness of key controls. This is what overall most of the work is done at that phase. Based on the risk and control matrix and work program, internal auditors are likely to have a list of specific procedures and tests to be conducted. So what are other factors which are established in the work papers? These include management assertions, testing objectives, criteria, approach, procedures, population and sampling methodology, and sample sizes. However, some details may still need to be determined in the early stages of performing the engagement. Ultimately, internal auditors seek to reach conclusions as a result of executing the work program. For example, a conclusion about whether controls are effective in mitigating risks to an acceptable level. Extent of testing depends on the sufficient audit evidence. With sufficient information about both the design adequacy and operating effectiveness of controls, internal auditors can conclude on whether existing controls are adequate to help achieve the objectives of the area or process under review. The extent of testing depends on whether test results have produced sufficient audit evidence on which internal auditors can base their conclusions or advice. If the testing procedures prescribed in the work program do not provide sufficient information to make conclusions and recommendations, internal auditors may need to adjust the testing plan and perform additional testing. We may refer to Assurance Standard A12240, which requires adjustments to the work program to be approved promptly. As we have seen before, that testing approaches often include a combination of manual audit procedures and computer-assisted audit techniques. And we explained that the CATs include generalized audit software programs and programs that specialize in testing the processing, logic, and controls of other software systems. Like the testing information described previously, the engagement testing procedures are usually determined during the development of engagement work program. Internal auditors may test a complete population. Right now, using the technology, spreadsheets, and ERP, you can do that by a click, or you can select a representative sample of information. If they choose to select a sample, they are responsible for applying methods to assure that the sample selected represent the whole population and or time period to which the results will be generalized. We have already seen a list of what can be the examples of manual audit procedures. Let's have a little more detail about that. Simple manual audit procedures include gathering information through inquiry, interview, surveys, observation, and inspection. Other manual audit procedures may take longer to conduct but generally provide a higher level of assurance. The examples may include vouching. Internal auditor tests the validity of documented or recorded information by following it backward to a tangible resource or a previously prepared record. Tracing, which is internal audit, tests the completeness of documented or recorded information by tracking information forward from a document, record, or tangible resource to a subsequently prepared document. Re-performance is when the internal audit tests the accuracy of a control by re-performing the task, which may provide direct evidence of the control's operating effectiveness. And independent confirmation, where internal auditors solicit and obtain written verification of accuracy of information from an independent third parties. You may take an example of the account receivables, where internal auditor can directly contact and get the balances. Similarly, analytical procedures, they are used to compare information based against the expectations based on an independent or unbiased source, and the premise that certain relationships between information can be reasonably expected in the absence of conditions to the contrary. Analytical procedures may also be used during engagement planning. What are the examples of analytical procedures? Ratio analysis, trend and regression analysis, reasonableness test, period-to-period comparisons, forecasts, benchmarking information against similar industries or organizational units. Internal auditors may further investigate or any significant deviations from the expectations to determine the cause and reasonableness of the variance, for example, fraud, error, or a change in conditions. Unexplainable results may indicate a need for additional follow-up and may suggest the presence of a significant problem that should be communicated to the senior management and board. Internal auditors apply their experience, logic, and professional skepticism to evaluate the information discovered throughout the engagement and reach logical conclusions. Internal auditors generally approach engagements with an objective and inquisitive mind, searching strategically for information that could fulfill the engagement objectives. At each step in the engagement process, they apply professional experience and professional skepticism to evaluate whether evidence is sufficient and appropriate to formulate conclusions and recommendations. According to Standard 2330, documenting information, internal auditors must document information that logically supports the engagement results and conclusions. However, this does not mean that the internal auditors should exclude relevant information that may contradict the conclusions. Why internal auditors should conduct a root cause analysis? Internal auditors often conduct a root cause analysis to identify the underlying reason for the occurrence of an error, problem, missed opportunity, or instance of non-compliance. The RCA enables the internal auditor to add insights that improve the effectiveness of the and efficiency of the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes. However, these analyses also sometimes require extensive resources such as time and subject matter expertise. Thus, when conducting a risk and control analysis, internal auditors must exercise due professional care by considering effort in relation to the potential benefit. Although complex issues may require more rigorous analysis, in certain circumstances, a risk and control analysis may be as simple as asking a series of why questions in an attempt to identify the root cause of a variance. For example, a worker fell. Why? Because oil was on the floor. Why? Because a part was leaking. Again, another why, because the part keeps failing. So another why will take you gradually to the root cause, because the quality standard for suppliers are insufficient. Most root causes can be traced back to decisions, actions or inactions by person or multiple people. However, determining a true root cause may be difficult and subjective, even after internal auditors have performed analysis of quantitative and qualitative data. In some cases, multiple errors with varying degrees of influence may combine to form the root cause of an issue, or the root cause could involve a risk related to a broader issue such as the organizational culture. Therefore, internal auditors may choose to include input from several internal and external stakeholders. In some cases, internal auditors may provide a variety of possible root causes for management to consider, based on an independent and objective evaluation of various scenarios as the root cause of an issue. When the time frame or skill levels needed to complete the root cause analysis exceed which is available within the internal audit activity, the chief audit executive may recommend that the management address the underlying issue and conduct further work to identify the root cause. I'll quickly go through the documents which is required as a consideration for demonstrating conformance of this standard, more or less similar nature. Work papers generally document sufficient information about engagements analysis, results, and conclusions to enable the reader to understand the basis of conclusions. Work papers also typically describe the test population, sampling processes, and sampling methods that the internal auditors used. And work papers are cross-referenced in the work program, supervisory reviews of the engagement, and may provide additional validation. So now we have reached to fourth standard of this series, 2330 now, documenting information. We learned in standard 2310 that the identifying information that the internal auditors must identify sufficient, reliable, relevant and useful information to achieve the engagement's objectives. These characteristics are equally essential for internal auditors to consider whether documenting information in work papers. As per this standard 2330, documenting information, internal auditors must document sufficient, reliable, relevant and useful information to support the engagement results and conclusions. So let's review the assurance and consulting standards of standard 2330, documenting information. As per assurance standard A1, the Chief Audit Executive must control access to engagement records. The Chief Audit Executive obtain the approval of senior management and legal counsel prior to releasing such records to external parties as appropriate. As per A2, which is regarding the retention of records, the Chief Audit Executive must develop retention requirements for engagement records, regardless of the medium in which each record is stored. These retention requirements must be consistent with the organization's guidelines and any pertinent regulatory or other requirement. As per Consulting Standard C1, the Chief Audit Executive must develop policies governing the custody and retention of consulting engagement records, as well as their release to internal or external parties. These policies must be consistent with the organization's guidelines and any pertinent regulatory or other requirement. So let's review what is standard says about the work paper documentation and as well as the formats and consistency of those work papers. The engagement work papers are used to document the information generated throughout the engagement process, including planning, testing, analyzing, and evaluating data, and formulating engagement results and conclusions. Work papers may be maintained on paper, electronically, or both. Use of internal software may enhance consistency and efficiency. The format of work papers and its content generally vary by organization and the nature of the engagement. However, it is important to achieve work paper consistency within the internal audit activity as much as possible, as it generally helps facilitate sharing of engagement information and coordination of audit activities. Because the Chief Audit Executive is responsible for such coordination and for developing the internal audit activities, policies, and procedures. So it is logical that Chief Audit Executive to develop guidelines and procedures for completing work papers for various types of engagements. The implementation guide also discusses the standardization of work papers. The use of standardized yet flexible work paper formats or templates improves the efficiency and consistency of the engagement process. Commonly standardized work paper elements include the journal layout, tick mark notations, for example, symbols used to represent specific audit procedures, a symbol of cross-referencing to other work papers, and designated information that should be saved permanently or carried forward into other engagements. Before documenting information, internal auditors should review and understand their organization's particular work paper development procedures, standardized notations, and any available templates or software that the internal audit activity uses. So what are the considerations for implementation as per the implementation guide of 2330, documenting information? Effective work papers contain information that is sufficient and relevant to the engagement objectives, observations, conclusions, and recommendations, which makes the information useful in helping the organization meet its goals. The information documented in effective work papers is also reliable because it is derived using appropriate engagement techniques which are documented. Perhaps most importantly, work papers contain sufficient and relevant information that would enable a prudent, informed person such as another internal auditor or external assessor or external auditor to reach the same conclusion as those reached by the internal auditors who conducted the engagement. Thus, work paper documentation is an important part of a systematic and disciplined engagement process because it organizes audit evidence in a way that enables re-performance of the work and supports engagement conclusions and results. Let's have a listing of what the elements may include in the work papers. They include the index or reference numbers, title or heading that identifies the area or process under review, date or period of the engagement, scope of work performed, statement of purpose for obtaining and analyzing the data, source of data covered in work papers, description of population evaluated, including sample size and sampling methodology. Methodology used to analyze the data, details of tests conducted and analysis performed. Conclusions including cross-referencing to work papers on audit observations. Purposed follow-up engagement work papers to be performed. Proposed follow-up engagement work to be performed, and name of the internal auditor who performed the engagement work. So proposed may involve that there are some engagement work you have performed as yet, but you can propose some further work also within your work papers. And review notation and name of the internal auditors who reviewed the work. A nicely prepared and developed working paper file should be self-explanatory. Generally, work papers are organized according to the structure developed in the work program and cross-reference to relevant pieces of information. The end result is a complete collection of documentation, electronic, paper or both, of the procedures completed, information obtained, conclusions reached, recommendations derived, and the logical basis for each of the steps. This documentation constitutes the primary source of support for internal auditors' communication with stakeholders, including senior management, the board, and management of the area or process under review. The supervisory review of work papers is typically used to develop internal audit staff. A supervisory review may also be used as a basis for assessing conformance with the standards and for maintaining the quality assurance and improvement program, which is useful under section 1300 for the internal and external assessments. So the documentation requires to demonstrate conformance with standard 2330 includes properly prepared and completed work papers, whether stored in paper or on paper or electronically, demonstrate conformance. Evidence that the engagement information is sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful may be demonstrated in management's effective implementation of recommended actions. When communicating engagement results to the appropriate parties, the Chief Audit Executive may also receive feedback about the quality of the engagement information documented, and the post-engagement surveys of the individuals who received the engagement information may also evidence conformance. So the last standard of the series 2300 is standard 2340, which is engagement supervision. Engagement supervision is a process that begins with engagement planning and continues throughout the engagement. During the planning phase, the engagement supervisor is responsible for approving the engagement work program and may assume responsibility for other aspects of the planning process. As per the basic requirement of standard 2340, engagement must be properly supervised to ensure number one, objectives are achieved. So that is why you set the engagement objectives. Quality is assured. And number three, staff is developed. So you are also looking for a consistent improvement within internal audit as well. As per the interpretation of the standard, the extent of supervision required will depend on the proficiency and experience of internal auditors and the complexity of the engagement. If the organization or the internal audit department is less mature and not having sufficient experience or trained staff or very junior, definitely a higher supervision and monitoring is required. And more details are shared with the supervisor, or supervisor is having more reporting methodologies and getting more details during their reviews. The Chief Audit Executive has overall responsibility for supervising the engagement, whether performed by or for the internal audit activity, but may designate appropriately experienced members of the internal audit activity to perform the review. Appropriate evidence of supervision is documented and retained. In addition to review the engagement objectives, the Chief Audit Executive should also review the internal audit policies and procedures. When planning how the engagement will be supervised, the chief audit executive should review the engagement objectives and the internal audit policies and procedures that support fulfillment of standard 2340, which is regarding engagement supervision. Even before the engagement planning process begins, the chief audit executive usually has developed internal audit policies and procedures to address how engagements are planned, performed, and supervised. Such policies and procedures may specify software programs or templates that internal auditors should use to establish consistent formats for work programs and work papers. Similarly, policies and procedures may address opportunities for staff development, such as a policy requiring post-engagement meetings between the internal auditors who perform the engagement and the chief audit executive or designated engagement supervisor. Skill assessments of the internal audit staff are ongoing, not solely as part of the engagement process. Skills assessment generally provides sufficient information about the internal auditor's competencies to enable the chief audit executive to appropriately assign internal auditors to engagements for which they possess the required knowledge, skills, and other competencies. Likewise, they enable the chief audit executive to designate a qualified engagement supervisor. So, what is the supervision role in the work program and its adjustments? The primary criterion for approval of the work program is whether it is designed to achieve the engagement objectives efficiently. Additionally, the work program must include procedures for identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and documenting engagement information. As per Assurance Standard A1 of 2240, any adjustments to the work program must be approved. Engagement supervision also involves ensuring that the work program is completed and authorizing any changes to the work program. The engagement supervisor typically maintains ongoing communication with the internal auditors assigned to perform the engagement and with management of the area or process under review. The engagement supervisor usually reviews the engagement work papers that describe the audit procedures performed, the information identified, and the observations and preliminary conclusions made during the engagement. The supervisor evaluates whether the information, testing, and results are sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful to achieve the engagement objectives and support the engagement results and conclusions as required by standard 2330 documenting information. As per standard 2420, which we will cover later on, quality of communications, it requires that the engagement communications to be accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. Engagement supervisors review engagement communications and work papers for these elements. And that's why it is important to discuss these at this phase as well. Because the work papers provide the primary support for engagement communications. Discussing the engagement process provides a lot of benefits and opportunities. Throughout the engagement, the chief audit executive or engagement supervisor meet with the internal auditors, which are assigned to perform the engagement, and discuss the engagement process, which provides opportunities for training, development, and evaluation of the internal auditors. When reviewing the engagement communications and engagement work papers, which document all aspects of the engagement process, supervisors may ask for additional evidence or clarification. Internal auditors may have an opportunity to improve their work by answering questions posed by the engagement supervisor. It would be handy to keep a track of all the queries and their resolution. It is preferred that the internal audit activity should retain a separate record of the engagement supervisor's concerns and questions, the steps taken to resolve them, and the results of those steps. These can be kept in the form of comments on your report, either in the form of track changes, comment box, or notes and responses thereof. This record should have chief audit executive supervisors for queries and comments, date of queries and comments, resolution dates, and when matter is addressed, old and revised reports, dated versions, justifications where comments were answered, any counter comments or additional comments from Chief Audit Executive Supervisor after resolution. Differences may arise in the professional judgment between the team, and then Chief Audit Executive may have to come up and resolve those differences. The Chief Audit Executive is responsible for all internal audit engagements and all significant professional judgments made throughout the engagements, whether by the internal audit activity or others performing the work for the internal audit activity. Therefore, the Chief Audit Executive usually develops policies and procedures designed to minimize the risk that internal auditors will make judgments or take actions that are inconsistent with the Chief Audit Executive's professional judgment and could adversely affect the engagement. The Chief Audit Executive usually establishes a means for resolving any professional judgment differences that may arise. This may include discussing pertinent facts, and not only discussing but documenting them, pursuing the additional inquiry or research, and documenting and concluding on differing viewpoints in engagement work papers. So if there is a difference in professional judgment over an ethical issue, the issue may be referred to those individuals in the organization who have responsibility over ethical matters. For example, an ethical committee exists, so that matter can be referred to that committee as well. So for demonstrating conformance with this standard 2340, again the similar nature of documents are required, but I'll go through all these. Engagement work papers, either initiated and dated by the engagement supervisor, if documented manually or electronically approved, if documented within a working paper software system. A completed engagement work paper review, checklist or memoranda of review comments. The assurance of engagement level quality may also be demonstrated through the Chief Audit Executive's maintenance of a quality assurance improvement program, which is under standard 1300, and the results of surveys soliciting feedback about the engagement experience from the individuals directly involved with the engagement. Internal auditors may have the opportunity to provide feedback about the engagement supervisor through peer review mechanisms such as surveys. So concluding series 2300, performing the engagement, the international standards for professional practice of internal auditing, the engagement process as per this standard is divided into 3 phases with a series of standards representing each. Planning, which is 2200 series. Number 2 is performing and supervising 2300 series, which we have just completed, and the next one is communicating 2400 series. In reality, the standards in these groups are not performed discretely and sequentially. Rather, some engagement work may be performed during the planning process, and planning, supervising and communicating occur throughout the performance of an engagement. So there is an overlapping as well, you might see, but you need to understand the process as well. Thus, in preparing to perform an engagement, internal auditors should review all 3 groups of standards and implementation guides concurrently. So thank you so much for staying till the end. Thanks for liking the videos. Please share my channel, share my videos, so other students and the professionals may get benefit from the review of the IIA standards. Please subscribe the channel and keep supporting me. Thank you so much.